The wind howled through the barn's weathered planks like a dying beast, carrying the scent of impending storm and the metallic taste of fear. Golden dust motes swirled in the last amber rays of sunlight that stabbed through the broken roof, each particle suspended in air, thick enough to choke on. The barn held memories in its bones, the gentle shuffling of horses, long since sold to pay mounting debts, the sweet mustiness of hay that would never again fill these empty stalls. And underneath it all the sharp tang of desperation that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Elise's heart pressed her spine against the rough-hewn wall, her arms wrapped protectively around her twin daughters, as if love alone could shield them from what was coming. At 26, she had already buried a husband and watched 2 crops fail under the merciless prairie sun, but nothing in her harsh frontier existence had prepared her for this moment of absolute terror. 5-year-old Lily burned with fever against her chest, each labored breath a tiny rasp that echoed like thunder in the oppressive silence. Her small body radiated heat like a coal from the fire, and her usually bright eyes were glassy with sickness that had been consuming her strength for days. Her twin sister Anna whimpered softly against Elise's other side, her small fingers clutching a battered tin compass that bore the engraved initials SM. All that remained of her grandfather, Samuel Miller's legacy from their Kansas homestead. The compass hadn't worked properly in years, its needle spinning wildly regardless of direction, pointing sometimes north, sometimes south, sometimes spinning in lazy circles, as if mocking the very concept of true direction. But the twins had carried it everywhere since their father's death, fascinated by its mysterious movements and the stories Caleb had told them about their grandfather's adventures as a young surveyor. Now Anna pressed the cool metal against her cheek, drawing what comfort she could from its familiar weight, while her mother's heart broke at the sight of such innocence, trying to find solace in a broken world. The engravings on its surface had been worn smooth by decades of handling, first by her grandfather's calloused fingers, then by her father's, and now by her children's innocent touch. The memory of Caleb's death crashed over her like a flash flood in a dry creek bed, sudden and devastating in its intensity. She could still see him laid out in their parlor, his weathered hands stained with ink from the water rights documents he had been secretly copying by lamplight, while she put the twins to bed with their favorite bedtime stories. 3 bullet holes had torn through his back, like obscene flowers blooming crimson on his white Sunday shirt, the same shirt he had worn to their wedding 5 years earlier, when hope still flowered in her heart, like prairie roses after rain. Sheriff Morrison had blamed drifters and horse thieves, spinning a tale of robbery gone wrong that satisfied no one, but seemed to close the official books on the matter. But Caleb's wallet had remained untouched in his vest pocket, his father's gold watch still ticking away precious seconds with mechanical indifference to human tragedy. Only his surveyor's notes and the damning evidence he had been gathering against Brimstone Bill Cutter had vanished without a trace, disappeared, as if they had never existed at all. Elise knew better than to believe the official story. In this harsh country, water meant life, and life meant power. Cutter had been systematically buying up every water source in the valley using a combination of legal pressure, economic coercion, and, when necessary, more direct forms of persuasion. Once he controlled all the water, he could dictate terms to every rancher, every farmer, every living soul within 50 miles. Pay his inflated prices for water rights, accept his terms for supply contracts, or watch your crops wither and your livestock die of thirst under the merciless prairie sun. The Heart Spring was the last independent water source, a clear stream that bubbled up from limestone depths that had remained unchanged since the world was young. Caleb had fought to keep it free and open available to any traveler or neighbor who needed clean water for their animals or their families. It was a principle worth dying for, as events had tragically proven, and now Elise found herself the sole guardian of that legacy. Her eyes swept the barn's interior with desperate calculation, cataloging anything that might serve as a weapon if the men outside finally lost patience with their cat-and-mouse game. A rusted pitchfork leaned against the far wall just beyond her reach, but potentially accessible if she could create enough distraction. A coil of hemp rope hung from a wooden peg, and scattered farm tools lay half-buried in straw and debris. A broken scythe handle, a bent horseshoe, a hammer with a cracked head that Caleb had been meaning to repair before his death cut short so many of his plans. Outside boots crunched on gravel with deliberate precision, each step measured and purposeful. The sound reminded her painfully of Caleb's morning ritual of checking the spring. But these footsteps carried menace instead of purpose. The measured approach of predators who had cornered their prey and were savoring the moment before the kill. She counted at least 4 distinct sets of footfalls, probably more men who moved with a confidence that came from superior numbers and firepower. "Come out, Widow Hart." The voice belonged to Dirk Hawley Cutter's chief enforcer, and a man whose reputation for solving problems with lead and steel was known throughout the territory. His tone was conversational, almost gentle, which made it infinitely more terrifying than any shouted threat or crude demand. "Papers are signed legal and proper down at the courthouse. Spring belongs to Brimstone Mining, now fair and square. No need to make this any harder on them twin girls of yours than it has to be." The false reasonableness in his voice made Elise's skin crawl, like insects were marching across her flesh. She had heard that same careful courtesy from bill collectors and mortgage holders from men who smiled while they twisted the knife deeper into your financial back. It was the voice of civilized brutality violence wrapped in the veneer of legal propriety. Through a crack between warped boards, Elise could see at least 4 silhouettes spread in a rough semicircle around the barn. They held their weapons with casual confidence, rifles and pistols that caught the last light of evening, like promises of death delivered with professional efficiency. These were not common criminals or drifters looking for easy money. They were professionals in the business of violence, and that business was booming under Cutter's expanding influence throughout the territory. The twins sensed her terror through that mysterious connection that linked mother to child, pressing closer, as if they could somehow shield her from the approaching storm. Lily's fever-bright eyes searched her mother's face for reassurance that Elise could not give, while Anna buried her face against her neck with the desperate intensity of a creature seeking shelter from a blizzard that threatened to destroy everything familiar and safe. In the gathering darkness beyond the barn, something else moved with lethal purpose and deadly grace. A shadow flowed like quicksilver between sagebrush and scattered boulders, silent as smoke and infinitely more dangerous than the men who announced their presence with heavy boots and casual threats. The shadow paused at the edge of lantern light, spilling from the barn's interior, and Elise caught a glimpse of copper skin and keen, dark eyes that seemed to measure distances and calculate odds with the cold precision of a born predator. Wakiza had been tracking the dust cloud raised by Cutter's riders since the sun reached its zenith, following them across broken country with skills learned in a harder school than any white man's university could provide. At 43, the Lakota warrior carried scars from 2 decades of frontier warfare. But his weathered face still held the sharp intelligence that had kept him breathing, when younger, stronger men had fed the crows and ravens that cleaned the bones of the unwise and unlucky. His long, black hair showed threads of silver, now braided with eagle feathers, and small bones that marked him as a man of the old ways, someone who remembered when the buffalo herds stretched beyond the horizon. And the only law was the natural balance between predator and prey. An old cavalry saber wound had left his left shoulder permanently stiff, a souvenir from the Battle of Little Bighorn, where he had fought alongside Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull against Custer's doomed column. But his eyes remained keen as a hunting hawk's, and his hands had lost none of their deadly steadiness when it came to matters of life and death. He owed a debt here, one that went deeper than mere gratitude and touched the very core of his personal honor. During the savage winter of 1876, when temperatures had plummeted so low that trees split like rifle shots in the frozen night, and the very air seemed to burn human lungs he had taken a bounty hunter's bullet in the gut and been running a fever that made the world spin like a child's top. Death had been stalking him through the snow, like a patient wolf growing closer with each labored step across the white wasteland that had once been familiar hunting grounds. Caleb Hart had found him collapsed in a snowdrift, more corpse than living man. His lips blue with cold, and his eyes already beginning to show the glassy stare that preceded the final journey to the spirit world. A white man finding a wounded Indian in those days had several options, most of them involving a quick bullet to end suffering or simply riding away to let nature take its course. The bounty hunters would pay good money for any proof of a dead warrior, and live Indians were considerably more dangerous than dead ones. But Caleb had made a different choice. He had risked his own family's safety to carry the wounded man to shelter, sharing his fire, his food, and his medicine, while expecting nothing in return except perhaps the knowledge that he had done right by a fellow human being. It was an act of compassion that transcended the racial boundaries and political conflicts that had turned the frontier into a blood-soaked battleground. During the long nights of recovery, as fever dreams gave way to healing sleep and strength slowly returned to muscles that had forgotten how to function properly, Caleb had spoken of his vision for the valley. Not the rape and pillage that men like Cutter represented, but sustainable partnership between human needs and natural abundance. The spring should flow free for anyone who needed clean water, just as the grass should feed any traveler's horses, and the wood should warm any stranger's fire. It was an old way of thinking, one that honored the land instead of merely exploiting it, that saw natural resources as gifts to be shared rather than commodities to be hoarded. Now Caleb was dead shot down like a rabid dog while riding his own fence line, and his widow and twin daughters faced the same forces of greed and violence that had claimed his life. Wakiza had come to honor both his debt to the dead and his respect for the living, but also to uphold the principles that Caleb had died defending. Finding the loose board he had spotted during his careful reconnaissance of the barn's perimeter, Wakiza worked it aside just enough to allow his lean frame to slip through like smoke through a keyhole. Inside the barn, he could smell the fear sharp and acidic as spilled vinegar mixed with the softer sense of sickness and exhaustion that clung to the huddled family like an invisible shroud. Moving with the fluid silence that had kept him alive through countless battles and narrow escapes, he approached the terrified woman and her children. His moccasined feet made no sound on the packed earth floor, and when he spoke, his voice was pitched barely above a whisper carried on the wind, like a promise rather than a threat. Pack your things. You have minutes before they lose patience. Elise's breath caught in her throat like a fishhook snagging flesh. She could not see clearly who had spoken from the shadows, but the voice carried quiet authority without cruelty, competence, without the casual brutality she had learned to expect from men in this harsh country. There was something in the tone that suggested capability and purpose qualities that had become precious beyond gold in her current desperate circumstances. "They'll kill us if they find us," she whispered back, her voice breaking with exhaustion and the weight of responsibilities too heavy for one woman to bear alone. "Then we make sure they don't find us. Move now, decide later." The shadow resolved gradually into the shape of a man, tall and lean as a winter wolf with copper skin weathered by sun and wind, until it resembled carved mahogany polished by countless years of handling. He wore buckskin leggings that had been mended many times with careful stitches, each repair telling its own story of hard travel and harder choices. A blue cavalry shirt, probably taken from a dead soldier in some forgotten skirmish, hung loose on his spare frame. His long black hair was braided with eagle feathers and small bones traveling gear that spoke of long journeys across hard country and the wisdom that came from surviving where others had perished. A bone-handled knife hung at his side with the casual ease of a tool used daily, and a Winchester rifle was slung across his back with the unconscious familiarity of a man who had learned that survival often depended on superior firepower and the will to use it without hesitation when circumstances demanded decisive action. "Who are you?" Elise managed to ask, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect under the circumstances. "Friend of your husband's. Name's Wakiza." He was already moving with purposeful economy, lifting a pitchfork from its peg on the wall and using the wooden handle to raise the door latch slowly and carefully, making no more sound than falling snow on still water. "Can you and the girls ride?" "Yes, but they're both sick and Anna's been running fever. I have horses waiting. Strong ones that can carry you all to safety." His dark eyes met hers with absolute certainty, the confidence of a man who had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious through careful planning and sheer determination. "You trust me and live, or you stay here and die with them watching. Choose now." The blunt words hit Elise like a dash of cold water in the face, washing away the paralysis of fear and replacing it with the sharp clarity that came with facing absolute necessity. There was no middle ground here, no room for hesitation or second-guessing. Life or death, safety or destruction, hope or despair. The choice was that simple and that final. Outside, Dirk's voice called again, closer now to the barn door, and edged with growing impatience that suggested his professional courtesy was wearing thin. "Mrs. Hart, we know you're in there somewhere. Found your tracks down by the creek, all muddied up like you've been hiding in the reeds and cattails with them twin girls. Just want to have a civilized conversation about that spring of yours. Might be we can work out some kind of arrangement that benefits everyone involved." Wakiza guided them deeper into the barn's concealing shadows, toward a wooden ladder that led up to the hayloft, where winter feed had once been stored against the harsh months when the prairie became a frozen wasteland, hostile to all life. Every movement seemed planned 3 steps in advance, each gesture economical and purposeful. He had clearly studied this place extensively before making his approach, mapping out escape routes and contingency plans with the thoroughness of a military strategist who understood that one mistake could mean death for everyone involved. "Up," he whispered, gesturing toward the ladder with barely perceptible motion. Quiet as morning mist on still water. Elise gathered both twins in her arms, Lily burning with fever, while Anna clutched the broken compass against her chest like a talisman that might protect them from the evil that surrounded their hiding place. The ladder rungs groaned under their combined weight, despite their careful movements, each sound seemingly as loud as gunshots in the oppressive silence that pressed down on them like a physical weight. She could feel the old wood flexing beneath their feet, protesting years of neglect and weather damage that made every step a calculated risk. Wakiza followed last, testing each rung with his full weight, before trusting it to hold his injured shoulder, protesting every movement, but his discipline overriding the pain through sheer force of will. The loft smelled of old hay and mouse droppings mixed with the dusty scent of dreams deferred and hopes abandoned to harsh reality. Cobwebs hung like tattered curtains in the corners, and pale moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof where shingles had blown away during winter storms. He moved immediately to a corner where the roof sloped low, revealing preparations he had made earlier during his reconnaissance. A rope was already secured to the main beam and fed through a gap where several shingles had been carefully removed to create an escape route invisible from ground level. The foresight and planning involved spoke of a man who understood that survival often depended on thinking several moves ahead of your enemies, on being prepared for contingencies that others might never consider. Below them, the barn door exploded inward with a crash, like thunder rolling across the prairie. Boots thundered on the packed earth floor, with the heavy tread of men who had grown tired of subtlety and were ready to proceed with more direct methods. Lantern light flickered up between the floorboards, like fingers of hell reaching for innocent souls, casting dancing shadows that made the loft seem smaller and more confined than it actually was. "Spread out, boys. Check every stall, every corner, every hidey hole." Dirk's voice echoed in the confined space, harsh with frustrated authority, and the promise of violence barely held in check. "That woman's got twin girls and something that belongs to Mr. Cutter, and he wants both back real particular-like. Tear this place apart if you have to, but Find them papers. One of the searchers proved more thorough than his companions, firing his rifle up through the loft floor in a pattern designed to flush out any hidden quarry. The strategy was crude, but effective random shots through old floorboards to make any concealed fugitives panic and reveal their position. A bullet punched through the ancient wood, missing Anna by mere inches and sending splinters showering down like deadly snow. The child pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a scream that would have betrayed them all, her wide eyes reflecting terror, but also the stubborn courage she had inherited from both her parents. Wakiza had already secured the rope around Elise's waist with knots that would hold her weight, but could be quickly released when she reached safety. The hemp was rough and noose strong enough to support several people if necessary. Both twins were wrapped in blankets and secured against their mother's chest and backed the arrangement designed to keep the girls safe during their descent, while leaving Elise's hands free to control the rope and manage their landing. When your feet touch ground, move straight to the arroyo behind the barn. 3 horses are waiting in the shadows, their paint mare for you, and one of the girls bay gelding for the other Mustang for me. His dark eyes met hers with the gravity of a judge passing sentence of life or death. Don't wait for us. Don't look back. Just mount up and ride north toward the river crossing. For their sakes, you do whatever it takes to survive this night. More shots splintered through the floor. As the searchers grew frustrated with their lack of success, the bullets chewing randomly through old wood and raising clouds of ancient dust that made breathing difficult. Some of the rounds came uncomfortably close to their hiding spot, and Elise could hear Anna whimpering softly against her back as the child sensed the danger surrounding them. Wakiza lowered the family through the roof gap, with careful control the rope burning Elise's palms as she guided their descent toward the tall grass that whispered secrets to the night wind below. The sensation of dangling in empty air with both daughters depending on her grip was terrifying, but the alternative was far worse. Her feet touched earth that felt as solid and welcoming as a mother's embrace after a long and dangerous absence from home. Above her, she could hear the crash of splintering wood and the frustrated cursing of men who had found only empty stalls and scattered debris where they had expected cowering victims. Their voices were growing louder and more agitated, suggesting that their patience was wearing thin and more violent methods might soon be employed. Then Wakiza was sliding down the rope with his rifle slung across his back, moving with the controlled descent of a man who had performed similar escapes many times before. His injured shoulder protested the abuse, but his face remained impassive as he absorbed the shock of landing and immediately began scanning their surroundings for signs of danger. They ran through grass that bent silver in the moonlight, moving in a low crouch that kept them below the sight line of watching eyes, while still allowing for the speed their desperate situation demanded. The buffalo grass whispered ancient secrets as they passed each step, taking them farther from immediate danger, but deeper into the vast uncertainty of the frontier night, where 1,000 different deaths waited for the unwary or unlucky. 3 horses waited exactly where Wakiza had promised, their forms barely visible, in the deep shadows of the arroyo that cut across the landscape like a scar left by some primordial flood. He had chosen his mounts with the same careful consideration he applied to everything else: a paint mare with intelligent eyes and the sturdy build of a horse that could carry a woman and child across hard country without complaint, a solid bay gelding built for endurance rather than speed, and a compact Mustang that looked capable of running from sunrise to sunset without breaking stride. The horses stood quietly, already saddled and ready for immediate flight. Grain bags hung from their bridles to keep them content during the wait, while blankets had been tied behind each saddle to provide warmth during what promised to be a cold night's ride across exposed prairie, where wind cut through clothing like frozen knives. Wakiza boosted Elise and Lily onto the paint mare with practiced efficiency, his hands gentle but firm, as he ensured they were properly seated and secure. The mare stood steady beneath their unfamiliar weight, her ears pricked forward attentively, but showing no signs of nervousness or rebellion. Then he lifted Anna onto the bay gelding with infinite care, wrapping her in a blanket and positioning her so she could maintain her grip on both the reins and her precious compass during the journey ahead. Stay low in the saddle and follow the draw north toward the river crossing, he instructed as he swung onto the Mustang with fluid grace despite his injuries. His rifle lay across his lap like a promise of protection, while his keen eyes never stopped their constant sweep of the surrounding terrain. They'll expect us to make for town or try to reach the main road where they can set up roadblocks. We take the long way around through country they don't know as well as we do. They rode through grass that had witnessed the passage of buffalo herds and war parties, following paths worn by countless generations of hunters, traders, and travelers seeking passage across the unforgiving landscape. The terrain was a mix of rolling hills and flat stretches broken by dry washes and rocky outcroppings that could provide cover, but also concealed potential ambushes. The moon was 3/4 full and bright enough to navigate by, but it also cast treacherous shadows that could hide an army of enemies or make a harmless bush look like a crouching gunman ready to open fire. Every rock formation seemed to conceal watching eyes, every rustle of wind, and through the sage sounded like whispered threats carried on the night air. But Wakiza led them with the confidence of a man who had learned to read the land's moods like pages in a familiar book, guiding them along routes that would leave minimal trail for pursuing trackers to follow, while avoiding the obvious paths that enemies might think to watch or block. Elise rode with the awkward stiffness of someone long out of practice, her hands white-knuckled on the reins as she fought to maintain her balance, while keeping Lily secure against her chest. Years of farm life had made her soft in ways that mattered now, more accustomed to walking behind a plow than sitting a horse for long distances across rough terrain. Her thighs already ached from the unaccustomed position, and they had barely begun what promised to be a grueling flight to safety through country that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. Anna swayed in her smaller saddle as exhaustion and fear made her movements clumsy. But she maintained her grip on the compass with determined fingers that refused to let go of the one tangible link to her grandfather's memory. When the child started to slip sideways, threatening to fall beneath the bay's hooves, Wakiza caught the gelding's bridle without breaking stride, steadying her with a gentle word spoken in his own language, something that sounded like a blessing or prayer for protection from the spirits that watched over innocent children. His shoulder sent regular bolts of fire through his consciousness, the old cavalry saber wound, torn open again by their desperate escape from the barn. But he had learned long ago to compartmentalize pain and function despite physical distress. Survival often depended on the ability to ignore your body's protests and focus on the task at hand, whether that task was tracking game across difficult terrain or staying alive long enough to complete a mission that others were depending on you to finish. Behind them, lantern lights bobbed like fireflies as Cutter's men cast about desperately for some sign of their quarry's passage. The searchers were skilled trackers in their own right, men who made their living following trails and hunting down those who tried to run from Brimstone Mining's reaching influence. But they were also impatient by nature and unfamiliar with this particular stretch of country, prone to following the first promising lead, rather than taking the time to sort out true sign from carefully laid false trails. The sound of pursuit was fading as distance and darkness worked in their favor. But Wakiza knew better than to assume they were safe. Cutter had resources throughout the territory, informants in every town, allies among local law enforcement, financial interests that gave him influence with judges and territorial officials. Running would buy them time, but it would not solve the fundamental problem of a powerful man who wanted them dead and had the means to make that desire a reality. When they paused to rest the horses at a tiny spring that bubbled up from limestone depths unknown, Elise finally found the courage to voice the question that had been gnawing at her since their desperate escape began. The spring was little more than a trickle of clear water emerging from a crack in the rocks, but it was clean and cold. And the horses drank gratefully, while their riders took the opportunity to stretch cramped muscles and check their weapons. "Why are you helping us? You don't even know us." Wakiza checked the loads in his Winchester with the automatic efficiency of a man who had learned that preparation could mean the difference between life and death. In situations where hesitation lasted precisely as long as it took an enemy to pull a trigger. His eyes never stopped their methodical sweep of the surrounding hills, cataloging every shadow and potential threat in the moonlit landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. "Your husband saved my life 3 winters past," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a debt that transcended simple gratitude. "I was gut-shot and running fever when he found me collapsed in the snow north of here. Could have left me to die, would have been safer for him and his family if he had. White men had plenty of reason to hate my people in those days, and some still do. Papa never mentioned meeting you," Anna said quietly, her small voice carrying across the night air with the clarity that only children could achieve when they spoke absolute truth. "Good men don't brag about doing what's right." Wakiza lifted Lily from her saddle with careful hands, pressing the back of his weathered palm to her forehead to gauge the progression of her fever. The heat radiating from her small body was alarming, burning through her like wildfire consuming dry grass in late summer. "She needs proper medicine soon, or we're going to lose her. I know people in town who can help if we can reach them safely." "We can't go to town," Elise protested, her voice tight with the fear that had become her constant companion. "Cutter owns half the badges in the territory, and the other half are too frightened to cross him. Anyone who helps us will end up like Caleb, dead in a ditch with a bullet in their back." "Not all of them." Wakiza settled Lily back on her horse with infinite care, making sure she was properly positioned and secure before they continued their dangerous journey through the night. Abel Carter's got no love for Cutter or his blood money. Neither does May Delaney. They're good people who remember what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. They rode on through the seemingly endless night, following deer trails and dry washes that carved the landscape like ancient scars left by floods and geological upheavals that had shaped the land long before the first humans set foot on the continent. The terrain was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also familiar to Wakiza, who had spent decades learning every fold and valley, every hidden passage and secret water source in this part of the territory. He led them through routes that were invisible to untrained eyes, across stretches of stone that would leave no tracks for pursuers to follow, through narrow defiles that could be easily defended if they were forced to make a stand against overwhelming odds. His knowledge of the country was encyclopedic, accumulated through years of survival, in conditions that would have killed lesser men within days of exposure to the elements and the human predators that stalked the frontier's lonely places. The hours passed with agonizing slowness, marked only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on hard ground and the occasional soft cry from one of the twins. Lily had fallen into a fevered sleep against her mother's chest, exhausted by the trauma of their escape and lulled by the mare's steady gait. But Anna remained alert despite her exhaustion, her small hands never loosening their grip on the compass that had become her anchor in a world that seemed determined to tear away everything familiar and safe. As dawn painted the eastern sky, the color of fresh blood spilled on clean snow. They approached the outskirts of Willow Gap from an unexpected direction that would allow them to avoid the main roads where watchers might be posted. The town was a typical frontier settlement, born of hope and sustained by the kind of stubborn determination that it took to carve civilization from wilderness that seemed actively hostile to human habitation. A single main street ran between facing rows of false-fronted buildings that tried their best to look more substantial and permanent than they actually were. The Silver Dollar Saloon anchored one end of the street, its batwing doors already swinging with the morning's first customers, men who worked the night shift at various mining operations or simply had nowhere else to go when darkness fell, and honest people sought the safety of their homes. At the other end stood Hendrickson's General Store and Post Office, a solid brick building that served as the unofficial center of commerce and communication for the scattered ranches and mining claims that dotted the surrounding territory, like islands of human ambition in an ocean of natural indifference. Between these landmarks clustered the other necessities of frontier life. Abel Carter's blacksmith shop with its forge already glowing red in preparation for the day's work, Jameson's combination barbershop and bathhouse, where a man could get cleaned up and hear the latest gossip simultaneously, Morrison's dry goods emporium with its shelves full of everything from canned peaches to cartridges for Winchester rifles, and a handful of other businesses that served the needs of men and women trying to build something lasting in a land that seemed determined to tear down everything humans attempted to construct. Wakiza led them through a carefully planned route that avoided the main thoroughfares, where Cutter's paid informants might be keeping watch for unusual activity. They moved through a maze of back alleys and freight yards, past loading docks and storage sheds that provided concealment from curious or hostile eyes. The smell of coal smoke and bacon grease drifted from kitchen chimneys, mixing with the sharper scents of leather and metal that marked a working town in full swing. They dismounted behind Abel Carter's smithy, where the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil provided both cover for their whispered conversation and reassurance that they had reached a place where honest work still counted for something in a world increasingly dominated by corruption and violence. The sound was comforting in its regularity, speaking of skills passed down through generations and the satisfaction that came from creating useful things with your own hands. Abel Carter was built like the steam engines he occasionally repaired when mining equipment broke down and needed expert attention. He was a mountain of a man, with shoulders broad enough to yoke oxen and hands that could bend horseshoes like they were made of soft wire instead of tempered steel. He had come west after the Civil War, following the railroad crews and boom towns in search of opportunities that the settled East could no longer provide for a freed slave, with more ambition than most white men were comfortable acknowledging. His dark skin bore the permanent scars of hot metal and hard-living marks that spoke of years spent working with forge and anvil under conditions that would have broken weaker men within months. Burn marks from flying sparks dotted his massive forearms, and his hands were crisscrossed with thin white lines where red-hot iron had found its mark despite his careful techniques. But his eyes held the quiet dignity of someone who had earned his place in the world through sweat and skill rather than inheritance or political connection. And his reputation for honest dealing was as solid as the iron he shaped with such consummate artistry. He had tangled with Cutter before over water rights and fair wages, standing his ground when lesser men had been bought off or intimidated into silence. More than once, he had used his massive fists to settle arguments that words alone could not resolve, and his willingness to back up principle with action had earned him the respect of working men throughout the territory. Cutter's organization had learned to approach Abel with considerably more caution than they showed most potential obstacles to their expanding empire. Elise Hart, Abel said, wiping his hands on his leather apron as he took in her exhausted appearance and the twins' obvious distress with a single comprehensive glance. Years of living on the frontier had taught him to read situations quickly and accurately, to assess threats and opportunities in the time it took most men to blink twice. Heard tell you had some trouble out your way last night. Smoke been visible for miles, and riders been asking questions all over town about your whereabouts. More than trouble, Elise managed to say, her voice hoarse from fear and exhaustion that had pushed her beyond the limits of normal human endurance. They burned us out, tried to kill us all. Would have succeeded if not for... She gestured toward Wakiza, suddenly realizing that she still did not know the full measure of the man who had risked his life to save her family from certain death. Wakiza. The warrior supplied his attention focused on the surrounding area rather than the conversation taking place. Even in what should have been a safe haven, he remained alert for signs of danger, for the subtle indications that enemies might be closing in despite their careful precautions. It means determined in my people's tongue, though some might say stubborn would be more accurate. Cutter's work, I'm guessing. Abel asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer to his own question. The big blacksmith had been expecting this confrontation for months, watching as Cutter systematically tightened his grip on the valley's water supply through a combination of legal manipulation and outright intimidation. His men anyway. They want the spring and they're willing to commit murder to get it. Elise's voice carried a bitterness that had been growing like a cancer since Caleb's death. Fed by the realization that justice and law were not the same thing in a territory where money could buy badges and judicial decisions. They killed my husband for trying to protect what was ours by right, and now they want to finish what they started. Abel nodded with grim understanding. The Heart Spring was the final piece in a puzzle that would give Brimstone Mining complete control over the economic life of every ranch, farm, and business for 50 miles in any direction. Once Cutter owned or controlled every significant water source, he could dictate terms that would make him richer than most Eastern industrialists, while reducing everyone else to the status of sharecroppers on land their families had owned for generations. "What kind of proof you got against him?" Abel asked, getting straight to the heart of the matter with the directness of a man who had no patience for elaborate social niceties when lives were hanging in the balance. Elise's face went pale as she realized the full magnitude of the mistake she had made in her panic to escape from the burning farmhouse. In her desperate flight to save the twins' lives, she had left behind the most important thing at the evidence that could expose Cutter's crimes and protect her legal claim to the spring that was now their only hope of survival. "It's still at the farm," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of Abel's work and the normal bustle of morning activity in the town beyond. Hidden under the barn floor, where Caleb kept his most important papers. Documents showing unpaid wages, illegal timber sales bribes to territorial officials, water rights fraud. Everything we'd need to prove what he's been doing. Without them, you got nothing but your word against his. Abel finished for her, his expression reflecting the grim reality of their situation. And his word carries a lot more weight in this territory than justice has any right to allow. Judges, sheriffs, territorial legislators, half of them are in his pocket, and the other half are too scared to cross him. Wakiza was already checking his rifle with the methodical care of a man preparing for battle. His weathered face set in lines of determination that spoke of decisions already made and accepted, regardless of the personal cost they might entail. Then we go back and get those papers before he realizes what we're after and destroys them. That's suicide. Elise protested, her voice tight with the kind of fear that came from having already lost more than any person should have to endure in one lifetime. They'll be watching every approach to the farm, expecting us to try exactly that. It's what any reasonable person would do under the circumstances. Maybe, Wakiza acknowledged. But they won't be watching all the approaches. They found nothing in the barn during their search last night, so they'll figure we took everything important with us when we ran. They'll be watching the roads and the obvious hiding places, but they don't know about our cache or how well I know that country. It was a desperate plan, born of necessity rather than preference. But desperation was all they had left to work with. Without Caleb's carefully gathered evidence, the survey documents that established the spring's boundaries, the original territorial patent that proved the Hart family's legal claim, and most crucially, the pages copied from Cutter's private ledger that detailed years of systematic corruption, Elise would have no legal standing whatsoever. But first, Lily needed immediate medical attention, or their desperate mission would be meaningless, regardless of its outcome. The child's fever was worsening by the hour, and without proper treatment, she might not survive long enough to see her family's vindication or her mother's triumph over the forces that had destroyed so much of what they held dear. May Delaney's clinic occupied a converted cabin on the quieter side of town, as far from the saloons and gambling halls as geography would allow. The building was marked by a hand-painted red cross on the whitewashed door, a symbol that had brought hope to countless families during medical emergencies over the past 2 decades. The structure itself was modest, but well-maintained with clean windows and a small herb garden that provided many of the medicines May used in her practice. May herself was a study in contradictions that perfectly suited the frontier Irish temper wrapped in maternal gentleness, with steel-gray hair that had once blazed red as autumn leaves and hands that could deliver a breech birth or extract a bullet from a wounded man with equal skill and steady nerves. She had seen everything the harsh country could throw at human flesh and spirit, and very little surprised her anymore. "Bring her inside quickly," May said after one look at Lily's fevered face and the exhausted desperation written in every line of Elise's posture. "How long has she been running this high a temperature?" "Since yesterday morning, maybe longer. She's been poorly for days, but I thought it was just a summer cold that would pass on its own." Elise's voice carried the guilt that every parent felt when a child's illness progressed beyond their ability to provide comfort and care. May's experienced hands moved over Lily, with gentle efficiency checking pulse and temperature, examining throat and ears, looking for the telltale signs of the various fevers that stalked frontier children like wolves hunting sheep in winter pastures. Her diagnosis came quickly delivered with a matter-of-fact tone of someone who had seen too much to waste time on false comfort or gentle lies. "Scarlet fever, but not the worst case I've encountered in my practice. Still dangerous if it goes untreated, especially for a child her age, and in her current weakened condition." May was already moving toward her extensive collection of medicines, selecting bottles and packets with the sure knowledge of long experience. She'll need constant care for the next few days: quinine for the fever, willow bark tea for the pain, and complete rest until her body can fight off the infection. While May worked over Lily with the focused intensity of a general planning a crucial battle, Wakiza maintained his vigil at the clinic's single window. His keen eyes tracked every movement on the street outside, cataloging faces and noting who seemed to be lingering with too much interest in the medical building's activities. Anna stood beside her sister's makeshift bed, still clutching the broken compass that had become her most treasured possession. The child's face was pale with exhaustion and worry, but her eyes held the same stubborn determination that had carried her family through so many previous hardships. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of boots on the boardwalk outside grew louder and more purposeful. A gentle knock came at the clinic door, followed by a voice that carried the careful authority of a lawman, trying to sound reasonable and concerned rather than threatening. "Young May, it's Deputy Monroe. Word around town is you might have some visitors who could use official protection. Just want to make sure everyone's safe and accounted for, especially those heart-twin girls." At the sound of that particular voice, something flickered across May's weathered features, not fear exactly, but a kind of recognition mixed with sadness and perhaps disappointment. She moved quickly to examine the broken compass that Anna still clutched in her small hands, noting the initials SM engraved in its tarnished surface with the careful attention of someone who had learned to notice details that others might overlook. "Back door," May whispered urgently, already moving toward the rear of the building with the efficient haste of someone who had planned for exactly this kind of emergency. "Through the herb garden to the alley. We can reach the livery stable from there." But their escape route had been anticipated by men who understood that desperate people would naturally seek the path of least resistance. As they slipped out through May's carefully tended garden, the sound of boots on wooden planks told them that the back alley was also being watched by eyes that missed nothing, and hands that were ready to draw weapons at the first sign of resistance. They were trapped between two forces, with nowhere to run and no way to fight their way clear without putting the twins in even greater danger than they already faced. The clinic's back door opened with deliberate slowness, and Deputy Jed Monroe stepped into the garden like a man approaching a grave where someone he had once loved lay buried. He was a man in his late 20s with sandy hair and green eyes that seemed somehow familiar to anyone who looked closely enough to notice such details. When those eyes fell on Elise, He stopped short, his professional demeanor cracking just enough to reveal something deeper pain recognition and years of carefully buried guilt that had been eating at him like a cancer. "Mrs. Hart," he said, his voice rougher than it should have been for such a simple official greeting. "I need you and the girls to come with me. For their safety, you understand." But Elise was staring at him with growing recognition, her mind making connections that defied logic, but felt true in ways that transcended rational thought. Those eyes, that stubborn jawline, the way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, a habit she remembered from childhood, from a time when the world had made sense and families stayed together no matter what storms might come. Anna stepped forward, holding up the broken compass, where he could see the initials clearly engraved in the metal that had once belonged to their grandfather. "Do you remember this?" she asked, with the directness that only children could manage. The compass, and more importantly, the question hit Jed like a physical blow, delivered by someone who knew exactly where to strike for maximum effect. His hand moved instinctively toward his holstered Colt, then stopped as if burned by contact with the weapon he had worn for so many years, in service of men who cared nothing for justice or family loyalty. The careful mask of Deputy Monroe crumbled away like sand in a strong wind, revealing the lost boy who had disappeared from a Kansas farmhouse 25 years ago. "Hello, little sister," he said, his voice barely above a whisper that carried the weight of decades of separation and regret. The revelation hung in the garden air, like smoke from a funeral pyre, heavy with implications that changed everything about their situation, while somehow making it infinitely more complex and dangerous. May stepped forward with understanding, finally dawning on her weathered features, pieces of a puzzle she had never thought to solve, falling into place, with the clarity that came from seeing the family resemblance that had been there all along for anyone with eyes to see it. "The Miller children," she said quietly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had witnessed both their births in a cabin that seemed like it belonged to another lifetime. "Samuel and Martha's boy and girl. I should have seen it sooner, should have recognized the signs. You changed your name." Elise whispered, her voice carrying decades of hurt and confusion that had never been properly addressed or resolved. "We thought you died in the granary fire. Pa said you were buried under the collapsed timbers, that there wasn't enough left to—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the horrible details that had haunted her childhood nightmares. "Pa said what needed saying to protect the family name and keep you from asking too many questions that didn't have good answers." Jed's voice was heavy with shame and regret that had been compounding like interest on an unpaid debt for 25 years. "I ran after they caught me stealing grain to sell on the black market. Changed my name somewhere along the trail west, tried to make something decent of myself despite the mistakes I'd made. If you were trying to make something decent, why are you working for the man who killed my husband?" The question cut through the air like a blade designed to find the heart of the matter, to strip away pretense and get to the truth that really mattered. The words hit him like a knife between the ribs, driving deep into wounds that had never properly healed, despite all his efforts to bury the past and become someone worthy of respect. His shoulders sagged, as if the weight of years was finally crushing him, beneath an accumulation of poor choices and moral compromises that had seemed reasonable at the time, but looked increasingly shameful in retrospect. "Because he found out who I really was," Jed said, his voice cracking with the strain of finally admitting truths he had been avoiding for years. "Threatened to expose my past unless I played along with his schemes. Said he'd make sure I never wore a badge again, never had any kind of respectable life, never amounted to anything more than a common criminal running from one failed town to another. So you chose respectability over family." Elise's voice was cold as winter stone, carrying the kind of judgment that could freeze blood in a man's veins. "I chose survival." The words exploded from him with desperate force, years of self-justification pouring out in a flood that he could no longer contain. You don't know what it's like to have every mistake you ever made hanging over your head like a sword that could fall at any moment. I thought I could control the situation, keep you safe, while keeping myself alive and maybe even prosperous. Anna had been listening to this exchange with the wide-eyed attention that children brought to adult conversations they didn't completely understand. But now she stepped forward and held out the compass to Jed with simple generosity. "Mama says this belonged to Grandpa Miller. Maybe you remember it better than we do." The gesture, so innocent and trusting, seemed to break something inside Jed that had been holding back a flood of memories and emotions. He took the compass with trembling hands, his fingers tracing the worn engravings as tears began to track down his cheeks. Before anyone could respond to this moment of family reunion, the sound of running feet and shouting voices filled the air around May's clinic. The building was surrounded by men who had grown tired of subtle approaches and were ready to resort to more direct methods of resolving the situation. But in the chaos of the moment, none of them noticed the red-scarfed gunman who had been watching from the shadows of a nearby storage shed, waiting for his chance to prove his worth to Cutter by accomplishing what others had failed to achieve. He struck like a snake that had been coiled and ready to attack, lunging forward with a sudden violence that characterized men who made their living through intimidation and brutality. His target was Anna the twin, who held the compass, the child whose capture would provide maximum leverage over the others, while also securing the family heirloom that might hold significance beyond its obvious sentimental value. Anna's scream cut through the air like broken glass as the man pressed a knife to her throat with hands that had performed similar acts many times before, without losing sleep over the consequences. The compass fell from her grasp, its needle spinning wildly as it hit the ground. "Drop your weapons." He snarled his voice, carrying the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. "All of you or the girl dies right here and now." Elise's world collapsed into a single point of terror, focused on her daughter's terrified face, on the thin line of red, where the knife had already begun to draw blood from tender skin that had never known violence or cruelty. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking with the kind of desperation that only a mother could truly understand. "She's just a baby. She doesn't understand what's happening." "Then you'll do exactly what Mr. Cutter says," the gunman replied with the casual cruelty of someone who had learned to use children as weapons in adult conflicts. "All of you, no exceptions, no negotiations." But he had made a fatal mistake in his moment of triumph, the kind of error that separated survivors from casualties in the deadly game of frontier violence. In grabbing Anna, he had turned his back on Wakiza, forgetting that a wounded warrior was still infinitely more dangerous than a frightened civilian. Especially when that warrior had spent decades learning how to kill quietly and efficiently. The Lakota's knife flew with deadly precision, taking the gunman in the shoulder and causing him to drop both blade and child as he stumbled backward with a scream of pain and surprise. But even wounded, he was still dangerous, still armed with a pistol that he drew with desperate speed as he realized his plan had gone catastrophically wrong. In the confusion that followed gunshots, screaming people running in all directions, the red-scarfed man managed to accomplish something that was both a victory and a disaster for his employers. Despite his wound, he managed to escape with Anna disappearing into the maze of alleys and back streets behind the clinic, while everyone else was distracted by his wounded companion who was bleeding and cursing on May's herb garden. By the time they realized what had happened, the kidnapper was gone, leaving only the echo of a child's terrified crying that seemed to hang in the air, like a curse upon all their heads. Elise's desperate screams followed the sound of a mother whose worst fears had just become reality in the span of a few heartbeats. Now, where did he take her? Elise demanded, grabbing Jed by the shirt front with desperate strength that surprised them both. "Where does Cutter keep his prisoners? Where?" "The mine." Jed whispered, his face white with horror at what his choices had led to, at the realization that his attempts to play both sides had resulted in the kidnapping of his own niece. Cutter's got a stronghold there built into the hillside like a fortress. He'll use the girl to force your surrender, make you sign over the spring deed. The ride to Brimstone Mine took them through increasingly industrial landscape as the sun climbed toward its zenith, transforming the morning's coolness into the kind of heat that made men sweat through their clothes and horses foam at the mouth. Steam engines coughed and wheezed like dying giants, powering massive pumps that kept the deep shafts from flooding while drawing water from the very sources that Cutter was trying to monopolize. The mining complex sprawled across the valley floor, like some mechanical cancer that had metastasized beyond all control or reason. Wooden buildings rose at crazy angles, connected by elevated tramways and timber chutes that carried ore from the diggings to the processing facilities. Smoking chimneys belched black clouds into the sky, while the constant noise of machinery created a din that could be heard for miles across the otherwise quiet prairie. At the heart of it all stood the great stamp mill where tons of ore were crushed to powder by massive hammers that fell with the regularity of a giant's heartbeat. The building itself was 3 stories of reinforced timber and iron, designed to withstand the constant vibration and stress of industrial processes that operated around the clock regardless of weather or human considerations. A wooden catwalk stretched across the rushing water 30 feet above the diverted Ash River, slick with spray from the artificial rapids below, and treacherous with moss that had grown in the constant humidity. The structure swayed with every gust of wind, its support posts groaning under stresses they had never been designed to bear for extended periods. It was here that Cutter had chosen to stage his final confrontation with the forces that threatened his carefully constructed empire of greed and corruption. The symbolism was unmistakable. He would demonstrate his complete control over both the life-giving water and the people who depended on it for survival. Cutter waited at the catwalk's center with Anna in his arms, and 2 of his most trusted gunmen flanking him like bookends made of violence and moral bankruptcy. The mine owner was a soft man who had grown fat on other people's labor and suffering with pale, watery eyes and hands that had never known a day of honest work in their pampered existence. But his voice carried absolute authority when he called across the industrial din the confidence of a man who believed he held all the winning cards in a game where the stakes were measured in human lives rather than mere money. Anna struggled weakly in his grasp, her small hand still reaching toward the ground where she had dropped the compass during her abduction. The child's eyes were wide with terror, but they also held the stubborn courage she had inherited from both her parents, a refusal to surrender, even in the face of overwhelming odds. "Come closer, Mrs. Hart." Cutter shouted his words barely audible over the thunder of machinery and rushing water. "Let's discuss reasonable terms for your daughter's safe return." Elise stood at the catwalk's edge, her empty hands raised to show she carried no weapons that might threaten the delicate negotiations he seemed to have in mind. Behind her, Wakiza crouched among the massive machinery with his rifle, while Abel positioned himself near the main support struts where his enormous strength might prove decisive if the situation deteriorated into violence. Jed stood between the groups, torn between loyalties that had defined and destroyed his adult life in ways he was only beginning to understand. "What do you want?" Elise called back, though she already knew the answer to her question. "Simple business transaction." Cutter replied with the jovial tone of a man conducting routine commerce. "Deed to your spring in exchange for your daughter's life. Surely a reasonable woman can see the logic in such an arrangement." "The spring doesn't belong to me alone." Elise shouted back, her voice carrying across the water with desperate intensity. "It belongs to everyone who needs clean water. My husband died defending that principle. Sentiment's expensive in my line of work, Mrs. Hart. But children are priceless, aren't they?" Cutter's smile was visible, even at a distance, the expression of a man who believed he had finally cornered his prey and could afford to savor the moment of victory. "I'm sure we can reach an understanding that benefits everyone involved." As he spoke, one of his gunmen, nervous and sweating in the industrial heat and humidity, stepped wrong on the rain-slick planking that formed the catwalk's walking surface. The board beneath his feet, weakened by months of exposure to moisture and vibration, snapped with a crack, like breaking bones that echoed across the water with ominous finality. The gunman windmilled his arms desperately, trying to maintain his balance as momentum and gravity conspired against him. But physics was an impartial judge that showed no mercy to the clumsy or unlucky. As he fell backward, his flailing limbs caught Cutter hard enough to loosen the mine owner's grip on Anna, sending the child tumbling toward the churning white water 30 feet below. Time seemed to slow as everyone present watched in helpless horror, knowing that they were about to witness the death of an innocent child who had become the unwilling centerpiece of adult ambitions and hatred. The sound of rushing waters seemed to grow louder, drowning out heartbeats and breathing as Anna fell through the air like a broken doll discarded by a careless giant. Then Wakiza moved with the fluid grace that had kept him alive, through decades of warfare and violence, launching himself from his hiding place among the machinery, with a rope secured around his waist and desperation lending strength to muscles that had been pushed beyond their normal limits. He caught Anna in midair, their combined weight swinging them both toward a wooden platform built against the mill's massive stone foundation. The impact drove the breath from Wakiza's lungs and sent fresh waves of agony through his wounded thigh. But Anna was safe and breathing in his protective embrace. The child was crying a sound that was beautiful to her mother's ears because it meant she was alive and unharmed despite her terrifying ordeal. A bullet from above parted several strands of their lifeline, the rope beginning to fray under stresses it had never been designed to bear. But enough fibers held to prevent a fatal fall, allowing them to reach the platform where they could take cover behind solid timber and heavy machinery that would stop anything short of artillery. "Mama." Anna cried out, her voice carrying clearly across the chaos. "I dropped Grandpa's compass. It doesn't matter, sweetheart." Elise called back, tears of relief streaming down her face. "You're safe, that's all that matters." Cutter appeared in the mill's main doorway like some pale demon of greed and exploitation. His face twisted with rage at seeing his carefully laid plans disrupted by unexpected heroism and superior planning. In his hand was a brass lantern, its flame dancing with his agitated movements, as he struggled to comprehend how his moment of triumph had been transformed into disaster. "This entire town drinks clean water because of my mine." He screamed over the industrial din, his voice shrill with indignation and disbelief that anyone would dare challenge his authority. "This whole valley lives and prospers because of the jobs I provide and the money I bring in from outside markets. You destroy all of that for one stubborn woman and her worthless brats." But Abel Carter stepped forward from the shadows, where he had been waiting for exactly this moment, his massive frame blocking the doorway, like a mountain made of flesh and righteous anger. In his enormous palm lay a brass buckle, the kind used on saddle cinches throughout the territory, but distinctive in its craftsmanship and the subtle markings that identified its maker. He flipped it over with theatrical precision to reveal his maker's mark and the letters AC, cold forged into the back of the metal, with the skill that had made him famous throughout the region for quality work that lasted generations. Every piece that came from his forge bore those initials, a signature as distinctive as handwriting, and considerably more difficult to forge or duplicate. "Found this on your personal saddle, Cutter." Abel announced, his voice carrying clearly despite the noise of machinery and rushing water. "Made it myself 3 years ago, and I keep detailed records of every piece I forge. Made it special order for Caleb Hart with his initials worked into the leather pattern just the way he wanted it." A shocked murmur ran through the crowd of workers and townspeople who had gathered to witness the confrontation, and their voices rising like electricity through telegraph wire as the implications of Abel's revelation became clear. If Cutter was riding Caleb's saddle, it meant he had been present when the surveyor died present, and close enough to claim the dead man's personal effects as trophies of his victory. It was the kind of evidence that spoke louder than any witness testimony, the sort of proof that could not be explained away by clever lawyers or bought judges. The saddle buckle was a smoking gun that connected Cutter directly to Caleb's murder, transforming what had been whispered suspicions into undeniable fact. Cutter's face went white as fresh milk, then flushed red as spilled blood as he realized the magnitude of his mistake in keeping such obvious evidence of his crimes. He lunged for the mill's interior, seeking the sanctuary of familiar territory, where his word was absolute law, and his authority went unchallenged by anyone who valued their continued health and prosperity. But in his haste and panic, his lantern caught on a worker's sleeve as the man tried to get out of his path. Kerosene splashed across the wooden floor in patterns that promised disaster, the volatile liquid spreading rapidly across surfaces that had been dried by months of industrial heat and mechanical friction. Fire in a lumber mill was every worker's worst nightmare, and for excellent reasons that were about to become horrifically clear. The building was filled with flammable materials that had been accumulating for years, lubricating oils for the massive machinery canvas conveyor belts that carried ore from one processing stage to another, sawdust from cutting operations that coated every surface like fine powder, and the dry timber that formed the structure itself. Within moments of the kerosene, igniting flames were spreading with terrifying speed, despite the humid air rising from the river below. The fire seemed to have a life of its own, leaping from surface to surface with hungry enthusiasm as it consumed everything in its path. Soon the entire mill complex was becoming a towering inferno that could be seen for miles across the prairie, a beacon of destruction that announced the end of Cutter's industrial empire. The wooden catwalk began to groan and sway as the fire weakened its support posts, the ancient timbers crackling and popping as decades of accumulated stress finally found release through thermal expansion and structural failure. Men scrambled desperately for safety as the structure started coming apart beneath their feet like a house of cards collapsing in slow motion. But some were too slow or too confused by smoke and panic to escape the destruction that rained down like the wrath of an angry god. In the midst of this chaos and destruction, Elise and Jed found themselves facing each other across 10 paces of flame-lit planking like gunslingers in some penny dreadful novel brought to life through circumstances neither had ever imagined possible. The irony was bitter as Wormwood brother and sister separated by years of lies, and the corrupting influence of power exercised without conscience or moral restraint. Elise's shotgun was empty, had been empty since their river crossing days earlier, but she held it steady, despite the fire that burned in her bruised ribs with every breath she took. Her hands did not shake, and her green eyes held the cold determination of a woman who had lost everything except her children and her unwavering sense of right and wrong. "I tried to protect you," Jed said, his voice raw with emotions he had buried for years beneath layers of lies and self-justification that had seemed reasonable at the time, but looked increasingly shameful in the harsh light of consequences. "When the word reached me that you'd married and moved to this territory, I thought I could watch over you from the inside of Cutter's organization, keep you safe while keeping myself alive, and maybe even prosperous. You chose the wrong way to protect anything." Elise replied, but her voice carried sadness rather than anger, disappointment rather than hatred. There was still love in her words, and the kind of love that survived even the worst betrayals, because it was rooted in shared blood and childhood memories that no amount of adult foolishness could completely erase. May stepped between them with understanding, finally complete on her weathered features, pieces of a puzzle she had carried for decades, finally falling into place, with the clarity that came from seeing the family resemblance that had been there all along, for anyone with eyes to see it. "The Miller children," she said again, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had witnessed both their births in a Kansas cabin that seemed like it belonged to another lifetime. "I delivered you both held you when you were minutes old, and crying your first protests against a world that was already proving harder than it should have been. Should have recognized the signs sooner." Behind them, Cutter raised a hideout pistol with shaking hands, aiming at Elise's unprotected back. while she was distracted by her brother's confession and the weight of family revelations that changed everything about their situation. But Jed saw the movement in his peripheral vision, and for the first time in years, his choice was clear and immediate, uncompromised by considerations of personal safety or professional advancement. He threw himself between his sister and Cutter's gun, just as the weapon fired the bullet, taking him in the chest with an impact that spun him around and sent him crashing to the burning planking below. But his sacrifice had given Wakiza the clear shot he needed, the moment of opportunity that professional soldiers learn to recognize and exploit before they miss their chance forever. The Lakota's Winchester spoke once with the authority of final judgment, and Cutter pitched backward into the mill's flaming interior with a scream that was cut short by burning timber crashing down around him. His dreams of absolute control over the valley's lifeblood died with him, consumed by the same fires that had been fueled by his greed and moral corruption. Abel threw his enormous weight against the massive iron lever that controlled the main flume gate, a mechanism that was corroded and bent from years of neglect, but still functional for someone with sufficient strength and determination. The device had been designed for operation by multiple men using block and tackle systems, but the blacksmith's muscles were equal to the challenge of forcing it to respond, despite decades of accumulated rust and mechanical stress. The gears shrieked as the old machinery was pushed past its limits. The gate finally gave way with a thunderclap that echoed off the canyon walls, and the diverted river exploded back into its natural course with the force of liquid thunder. A wall of water 20 feet high and moving with the speed of an express train smashed into the mill's foundation, tearing away support beams that had stood for decades and washing everything in its path into the churning destruction of the river's reclaimed channel. The sound was deafening, like the world itself was being torn apart by forces too powerful for human comprehension or control. As the immediate danger passed and the flood waters found their new equilibrium, Elise knelt beside her wounded brother on what remained of the catwalk. Blood soaked through his shirt in patterns that told their own story of mortal damage, but his eyes were clear and focused on her face, with the intensity of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. From the wreckage scattered around them, Anna's voice called out weakly, "Mama, I found it. I found Grandpa's compass." The child had somehow retrieved the precious heirloom during the chaos, clutching it against her chest as Wakiza carried her to safety. The compass was battered, and its face was cracked, but the needle still spun with the same wild freedom it had always shown, as if nothing in the world could make it point true north. "The compass still doesn't work," Elise said softly, pressing the broken instrument into Jed's hand with fingers that trembled despite her efforts to remain strong for his sake. "Never did work properly," he whispered back, his voice growing weaker with each word, but still carrying the warmth of memories from a time when they had been children together in a world that made sense. But Pa always said it didn't matter which way the needle pointed as long as it brought family home when they needed each other most. May worked over him with desperate efficiency, applying every skill she had learned in 20 years of frontier medicine. But they all knew the wound was mortal. Too much damage to vital organs, too much blood loss, too little time for miracles or medical intervention to make any difference in the outcome. "I'm sorry," Jed whispered as his strength faded and his breathing became more labored. "For everything. For running away when things got difficult, for the lies I told to protect myself, for not being the brother you deserved to have." "You were," Elise replied, tears cutting tracks through the soot and grime on her cheeks. "At the end, when it really mattered, you were exactly the brother I remembered from our childhood." He smiled at that, the expression transforming his face back into the boy she remembered from their Kansas homestead, and the older brother who had taught her to skip stones and defended her from schoolyard bullies and shared his candy when she was sad. "Take care of them," he said, his voice barely audible above the sound of rushing water and settling debris. "Both of them, the way I should have done from the beginning." Then he was gone, and Elise was left holding the broken compass that had finally brought her brother home, even if that homecoming had come too late to prevent the tragedy that had claimed so many lives and destroyed so much of what they had all held dear. The weeks that followed brought change to Willow Gap, like spring rain after a long drought. Federal marshals arrived from the territorial capital to investigate systematic corruption. Cutter's organization was dismantled piece by piece, his ill-gotten wealth distributed to those he had wronged through fraud and violence. Judge Hartwell's ruling on the Hart Spring cited territorial statutes preserving public access to natural water sources when private ownership was properly documented, but public need could also be demonstrated. Elise retained full ownership of her property, while granting perpetual rights for anyone needing clean water, exactly the compromise Caleb had envisioned. Neighbors came from ranches 50 miles away to help raise a new barn on the Hart Place, working together with the spirit of mutual aid that had always been the frontier's greatest strength. The structure that rose was stronger and more beautiful than the original, built with quality materials that spoke of permanence and prosperity. The twins recovered differently. Lily's scarlet fever broke on the 4th day after May's treatment began, leaving the child weak but alert. Anna, who had endured the trauma of kidnapping, took longer to heal from invisible wounds. She had nightmares for weeks, needing reassurance that the compass was safe on the mantelpiece where Elise had placed it. Wakiza's recovery proved most complicated. The bullet wound in his thigh had damaged muscle and tissue in ways that would never fully repair, leaving him with a permanent limp. His shoulder reopened and re-injured repeatedly would never regain its full strength. But he was alive and functional, more than he'd expected when first slipping through that barn wall. 2 months after the confrontation at the mine, Wakiza announced his intention to return to nomadic life. Spring grass was coming up green across the prairie, and something in his warrior's spirit responded to the call of distant horizons. "You could stay," Elise offered as they sat on the porch watching the twins chase fireflies. "Help run the place permanently. The girls have grown fond of you." "I keep moving. It's what I've always done, what I need to continue doing. Some men are meant to wander and guard the spaces between settlements. But I come when you call." He smiled with genuine warmth, the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him. "I'll be here." But first, he had one obligation to fulfill. At traditional Lakota fishing grounds, winter storms had damaged ancient fish weirs that his tribe had maintained for countless generations. Wakiza spent a week working in cold water alongside his nephew, rebuilding structures that allowed salmon upstream passage while providing sustainable harvest. The work was painstakingly precise, each stone placed according to oral tradition, each willow branch woven in patterns that guided fish without harm. His nephew watched intently, learning technical skills and deeper philosophy. "Why do we leave gaps for the fish to pass through?" the boy asked. "Because we take only what we need, not everything we can get," Wakiza replied. "The river gives us life, so we must give life back to the river. It's the same principle your cousin Elise and her husband understood about the spring water belongs to everyone who needs it." When the weirs were completed, they stood as monuments to a different way of thinking about the relationship between humans and natural systems. The salmon could continue their ancient migrations, while the people could harvest enough to meet their needs without destroying the source of their sustenance. On his final evening, Wakiza sat in the barn doorway as the sun painted western mountains blood red. His traveling pack rested beside him, filled with supplies for the journey ahead. Both twins came to say goodbye. Lily brought him coffee, black and strong, exactly as he preferred it. Anna had made a drawing stick figures that clearly represented their family, including a tall figure with long black hair that could only be him. "Are you really leaving us?" Lily asked with childhood's directness. "For now, but you'll come back when we need you," Anna added, still clutching the compass. From his pack he withdrew an eagle feather, worked with intricate beadwork in patterns that told stories of courage, sacrifice, and the bonds that connected all living things. He placed it carefully in Anna's free hand. For both of you to remember that some things are worth protecting, and that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who stand with you when the world tries to tear you down. Elise looked out at the spring where clear water bubbled from limestone depths unchanged since before humans walked the continent. The water belonged to everyone, and no one sustained by rains that fell on distant mountains and snow that melted in hidden valleys. "I'll come back," Wakiza promised with absolute certainty. As darkness settled over the prairie, Elise drew water from the stock tank that her husband had built with his own hands. The same water he had died protecting now flowed freely to anyone who needed it. Fireflies began their nightly dance among the cottonwoods, brief lights flickering like earthbound stars. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, with wild voice speaking of spaces beyond human law. The barn stood solid against the night-straight walls and tight roof, witnessing what people could accomplish when they worked together. Inside its welcoming shelter, 4 figures sat in comfortable silence, a woman who had discovered strength she never knew. She possessed children who had learned that home was worth fighting for, and a man who had found that some debts could only be repaid by living well. The broken compass sat on the mantelpiece, now its needles spinning freely without direction. But it had served its true function, bringing family together when it mattered most, proving that some bonds could survive any distance or betrayal. The initials SM caught lamplight, occasionally reminder of the grandfather whose legacy had ultimately brought his family home. No speeches were needed. The work was done, justice had been served, and tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The spring would continue to flow, long after their names were forgotten, and the seasons would turn an eternal pattern, and life would go on according to rhythms older than memory. Above them, stars emerged one by one in the endless prairie sky, ancient lights that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of countless dreams. Their cold fire had illuminated paths home for travelers since time began, and would continue long after the last human voice fell silent. Peace settled over the heart place like dust after hard riding, carrying the promise that some things, family loyalty, neighborly cooperation, the clear water of an honest spring, would endure as long as people were willing to fight for them. In the morning, Wakiza would ride toward the horizon, following trails that led to adventures only he could understand. But he would return as he had promised, whenever friendship or justice called him back to this place, where water flowed free, and family meant more than blood relation. And in the house where lamplight glowed warm against prairie darkness, a woman who had lost everything and found it again would tell her twin daughters stories of courage and sacrifice, of the warrior who had come when they needed him most, and of the uncle who had finally found his way home just in time to prove that redemption was possible, even for those who had lost their way in the wilderness of poor choices and moral compromise. The broken compass would never point true north again, but it had guided them to something more valuable than mere direction. It had shown them the way home to each other, and to the understanding that some journeys were worth taking regardless of the cost, and some destinations were worth reaching even if the path led through valleys of shadow and rivers of tears.